So again, my name is Porchia Moore. I am a fifth-year doctoral candidate at the School of Library and Information Science. And I'm also earning a certificate in museum management. So a lot of people ask me, why do you write a lot about museums if you're in the library school? So technically, I'm not really a librarian. I'm what's called an information scientist. And the information that I'm concerned about is cultural heritage. So that makes me a little bit of an odd bird. And I have a special fellowship which asks us to look at the relationship between libraries, archives, and museums. And so I'm what's called a cultural heritage informatics librarian. I want to talk to you a little bit about just kind of who I am and what my research interests are, and we'll jump right into talking about the process for creating the gallery space and also some of the artwork. So I'm born and raised in Columbia, South Carolina. My family is from the PD region. Has anybody ever been to Johnsonville, South Carolina? Really? Really? From where? Okay, wow. Usually when I say that, people are like, what are you talking about? And my mother was a fourth grade teacher for over 30 years at Hopkins Elementary School. And she was in charge of planning a lot of the field trips for the school. And I started going to school with her when I was in kindergarten. And I found myself, for the bulk of my life, the early part of my life, always being in a museum. And that really, really created a love and a passion for me for art and culture and heritage. And as I got older and I started to travel, I lived abroad in Japan for several years. Whenever I was at an art exhibit in particular, but usually any kind of museum space, I was always trying to figure out why I seemed to be the only person of color in that space. So I started asking sort of critical questions about why is it that I am gravitated towards those spaces, but also those spaces seem to be spaces that are not necessarily appealing to or engage with communities of color. So in a large part, that's what my research is really about, trying to figure out ways to get communities of color engaged with museum spaces. And when I lived in Japan, I came back to Columbia and spent about a year and a half, almost 2 years, as a docent here at the museum back in maybe 2005. Fell in love with it, really loved being here, working with this institution, and then I got my dream job and I moved to the border, and essentially I lived in Mexico for several years. I don't speak Spanish. That was one of my goals for moving there. I was actually the director of a creative writing program. So my first love and my first nature is writing and language and poetry. So my heart is that I am a poet. So I came back to Columbia. I entered my PhD program. I interned here twice and have really built a relationship, have been very supported by Karen and Joelle, Kaylee, everyone in the education and engagement departments who kind of let me play around with my research ideas, which is a really, really good and healthy, beneficial thing. A lot of people don't really have that opportunity. And I was hired here in the fall as a consulting curator, and that has been a very life-changing and very affirming position for me. And I wanted to show you some pictures. This was my very first show that I got a chance to curate here at the museum. This space used to be called Gallery 15. And I say used to because in my mind now, it is now the Spoken Gallery. I have changed the name. But it used to be called Gallery 15. It was a sort of, it's located upstairs. It's kind of a smaller community gallery. And Will South, who's the curator here, who is very, very supportive of my work as well, basically said, this is your space, you're going to curate it, bye-bye. And I was a little bit, you know, it was a great experience. And so the work here is by an artist named Joseph Norman, who is a professor at the University of Georgia. He is a phenomenal human being, a fantastic artist. And we had two of his collections. One was Out at Home, the Negro Baseball League series. And then the other series was Patty's White Lies. And so that was me. I had to, I had to include, yeah, and that's Susan. And Alan's somewhere over there. Alan's not in the frame, but Alan's in this shot too. So Will and I started having discussions about what this gallery space could be, what it should be, how it could best meet community needs. And he essentially came up with the idea of changing this gallery space from Gallery 15 to a dedicated space for African American artwork, which I think is a phenomenal idea, because I think that there's a perception, not only with this institution, but with many institutions, that museums don't necessarily spend a lot of time and money and energy buying works or collecting works from African American artists. And as we started thinking about, again, what this space could look like, we decided that this gallery space would be essentially a rotating African American art gallery space. So the very first iteration of that is located upstairs now. It's called Spoken, and I'll talk a little bit more later about what that means. And the idea is that it will rotate every 3 to 4 months with new works by African American artists from the permanent collection, which is a big, big thing, not only for this institution, but also for the city. So as I started thinking about some big questions for the theme for the space, again, the possibilities for the space, it really forced me to think about my own identity, what it means to be Black, what it means to be an African American in the 21st century. And it really took me all the way back to my childhood. So I want to ask permission if I can share a personal story with you all. So, and also as you look, all of these images are of men. And I think if someone were to ask me who were my influences, I think I would largely name women. But as I prepared for the talk today and also in preparing for the creation of the gallery space, I realized that my identity in a lot of ways is very much tied to these men. So the first image that I want us to look at is this one in the bottom right. And who is that? James Brown. Okay. So James Brown, when I think about how I formed my identity as an African American in this country, I grew up with James Brown as like the soundtrack in my household. And I remember my sister and I and all of my cousins, we did two things. We always watched Little House on the Prairie, because that was like the best show ever. We always played, what's her name? Laura Ingalls and what's the girl? The girl that she was always fighting with. Oh, Nellie. Nellie Olsen. Like if you were the cousin who people didn't like for the day or whatever, you'd have to be Nellie Olsen. So I had to be Nellie Olsen a couple times. But we would always like be at my grandma's farm and we'd be outside dancing and stuff. And the soundtrack to my sort of understanding of who I am was James Brown's I'm Black and I'm Proud. We had like whole routines to that. The second image here, when I started thinking about like how identity is formed in this country, is of, who's that? Jesse Jackson. So again, my mom was a fourth grade teacher. I went to Hopkins Elementary with her. That's a predominantly African American school in a sort of rural area in Hopkins, South Carolina. And I think from about the age of, or at least beginning in third grade, all of the teachers every morning would make the students recite Jesse Jackson's The Rainbow Coalition. And I have very strong memories of, it was sort of almost like we would do the Pledge of Allegiance, and then we would recite the Rainbow Coalition. And that had a very significant impact on me. It helped me to gain a sense of pride, again, a sense of identity. And as I started thinking about sort of what happened to that, like why did people sort of stop saying that? The other thing is from about second grade through about fifth grade, I had the most wonderful choir teacher. Her name was Gina Johnson. And Gina Johnson was the most beautiful woman. She had a beautiful, soft voice. She was a perfect teacher. But she was also the great, great, great granddaughter of James Weldon Johnson, who wrote the Negro National Anthem. And so she would talk about his legacy and the power of song and language. And part of our sort of curriculum for being in choir was to learn the Negro National Anthem. And she did it in such a way that it wasn't even so much about pride or the lyrics, but it was about her own personal heritage of being a Black woman born and raised in the South, being a descendant of someone like James Weldon Johnson. And the last image here, does anybody know who that is? Can you guess? I know it's not a good picture. That's my dad. So this is my dad, and my dad has several loves. So the first love is us, like he is a great, great dad. The second love used to be Dan Rather. So I spent my childhood coming home from school and literally preparing to listen to Dan Rather with my dad. And then after we did that, we'd play around a little bit or whatever, but then we would end our night reading the newspaper. And in the morning, he loved to get up and cook breakfast, but the soundtrack to that sort of process was we had one of those, I guess you'd call it like a stereo. It's like a big, huge thing, and it's got the record player in it. I mean, it took up a lot of space. It was pretty big. And he would get up before us, and he would put on the album of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. And he would be ironing our clothes and checking on us and flipping the sausage. And he would be reciting the words to the speech very, very loudly, to the point where if someone walked in, I would be pretty embarrassed. And he'd be like, I have a dream. It was very animated. I have a dream. He'd hand you your shoes, and he'd be talking to you as he's dressing you. And so as Will and I started to have conversations about the relevance and the significance and the importance of this new gallery that will be dedicated to African American art, we started having conversations about like, what is the theme? Like, what does it mean to be an artist, a Black artist in the 21st century? And what is Blackness when we have a Black president and we supposedly live in a post-racial society? So I want you to kind of think about those questions as I kind of move forward. So has anyone ever traveled to the Whitney Museum? Okay. So the Whitney Museum just moved into like forgot the amount, super multi-million-dollar facility. And it was a really important and noted occasion. And the Whitney invited Michelle Obama to come and give the opening remarks for the Whitney Museum. And she got into a lot of trouble for her comments about the museum. And what she was saying was she was very excited about the museum. She was excited about what she saw because of the fact that the exhibit was extremely inclusive. And it made her very hopeful about what the Whitney could be for communities of color. And so she said, there are so many kids in this country who think to themselves, well, that's not a place for me, for someone who looks like me. And that is literally why I do the research that I do, and why I'm very concerned about inclusion, and why I'm very happy that CMA has decided to dedicate a space for African American art. I came across this article several months ago. I thought it was a kind of catchy title. It's like basically like clickbait. But it said museums are keeping a ton of the world's most famous art locked away in storage. And we kind of know that. Like museums have a tendency to have a lot in their collections, but don't necessarily always show everything that they have. And as part of this article, they really wanted to look at like fine art and some of the big name artists. And they did like a sort of complicated survey, taking a look at each individual artist and looking at museums and looking at the totality of their work and what was actually being shown across the country and what was actually not on display, which I thought was very interesting. I could not believe that Frida Kahlo had such a poor showing of her work. The last artist has, none of his work is on view currently. We had just had a Georgia O'Keeffe, so I was real excited about that. Then this was a look at the display rates very widely at large museums. So it looked at the amount of the collection that's actually on display at different institutions. But the reason why, again, this caught my attention is because if you look at the kind of representation of the artists that they identified as artists of note or of merit, there's not really an artist of color, and there's not like a heavy presence of African American artists in particular. And I think this is, again, part of the tensions as to why communities of color don't necessarily feel welcome or engaged in art museums. So now I want to talk to you about the sort of the idea behind Spoken. So again, Spoken is meant to be a rotating art gallery space. And the idea is that in this country in particular, there are many understandings or assumptions about what it means to be African American. And again, as Will and I were talking, I just said that as we went through as well as I went through the permanent collection here at CMA and started thinking about what we had, being very hopeful about what we could get in the future, it seemed to me that the pieces that spoke to me were artists whose work were very central in highlighting and investigating and examining blackness or their understanding of blackness. And almost all of their artist statements sort of spoke to that. So I want to go back to the Negro National Anthem. So it was actually a poem that was written, and James Weldon Johnson's brother actually put it to music in 1899. And the very first time that it was sung was in Jacksonville, Florida, at a school for free blacks during the commemoration of Abraham Lincoln's birthday. And so I wanted you to hear the lyrics in the song. Okay, so I wanted you to hear that and to look at the lyrics, because as I started thinking about this show and this idea of African American art from the permanent collection, I really started to think about the fact that oftentimes in this country, African Americans are viewed as a single monolithic group. And I think that can be said of any group, actually. But I wanted to choose the pieces so that each piece could really and truly speak to the visitor in such a way that that voice would be heard. And, sorry. What I'd like for us to do is to look at some of the pieces from the show, and I'd like for us to have a little bit of interactivity. So again, I mentioned that I am a poet first and foremost, and one of my influences was James Weldon Johnson. He initially wrote this as a poem, and I think that because African Americans are sometimes viewed as having a monolithic voice, that in us looking at each of the pieces individually, we can see that those voices are actually not monolithic, and these experiences are not monolithic. So what I have designed is for us to kind of look at some of the pieces, and I have chosen poems that I think kind of give voice to those works. And I'm going to ask you all to join me, and so I'm going to give you some level of direction, and I'd like for you to read some of the poem with me as we go through each piece. So this is Elizabeth Catlett's Madonna, which she created in 1982. And I have here actually on the other slide, this is so we know that there are several artists who make variations of Madonna. This is one that I chose specifically because I felt like it was such a stark contrast with Catlett's Madonna. This is Botsy's Madonna. If you look at the baby, like look at his face. Like he's very happy, very content, sort of jolly. She has this sort of tranquil look on her face. And if you compare it though with Catlett's, tell me some of the emotions that you think you see when you compare those.
The mother looks like she's really wanting to protect the children. And I noticed the difference between the older child and the younger child. The younger child just looks kind of scared like a little kitty pig. The older one looks sort of like he knows what to be afraid of. And so he's wary because he knows a little bit about life.
Okay. So I have chosen Nikki Giovanni's poem, Mothers, and I'm going to ask you all to, when I count to 3, I'd like for you all to read the first stanza, and then I'm going to read the rest of the poem, okay? Okay, so let's try this out. Maybe we'll read the first line first. Okay, 1, 2, 3. I remember the first time I consciously saw her. We were living in a 3-room apartment on Burns Avenue. Mommy always sat in the dark. I don't know how I knew that, but she did. That night I stumbled into the kitchen, maybe because I've always been a night person, or perhaps because I had wet the bed. She was sitting on a chair. The room was bathed in moonlight, diffused through those thousands of panes. Landlords who rented to people with children were prone to put in windows. She may have been smoking, but maybe not. Her hair was 3/4 her height, which made me a strong believer in the Samson of my mother, and that she was very black. I'm sure I just hung there by the door. I remember thinking, what a beautiful lady. She was very deliberately waiting, perhaps for my father to come home. from his night job, or maybe from a dream that had promised to come by. Come here, she said, I'll teach you a poem. I see the moon sees me. God bless the moon, and God bless me. I taught it to my son, who recited it for her, just to say we must learn to bear the pleasures as we have borne the pains. And so I want to tell you a little bit about Elizabeth Catlett. She's mostly known as a sculptor, and we actually have some of her print work. This is a lithographic print. And she, her work largely explores the experiences of women and of usually impoverished African American women. And this is a quote that I wanted to share with you, sort of that examines her artist statement. She said, she deeply wished that public art had meaning for Black people, so that they will have some art that they can identify with, so they will be encouraged to explore what the museums and galleries have to offer them. And I thought that was a very powerful statement. This next work is from, how many of you know Tyrone Jeter's work? Okay, so this is actually a brand new acquisition for the Columbia Museum of Art. When I first saw this piece, I had such a response. First of all, the size of it. When you get upstairs, you'll see it's a large piece, but also this woman is a powerful figure. Her hair is kind of wild and unkempt. She's large like me, which I love because I'm usually the biggest person in the room, so I really was drawn to her. But also when you get upstairs, you will see that Tyrone has this really amazing techniques with paper and with charcoal. So when you look at the work up close, you will see that some of the paper is sort of crumpled and bent and folded. And he just has a sort of lovely technique. And so this piece is called I Done Old, I Done Tired, but I Ain't No Ways Done. And it was, he made this in 2013. One of my absolute favorite poets of all time, who I actually got a chance to meet less than a year before she passed away in Chicago. She has been a heavy influence on my personal writing. Her name is Lucille Clifton. When I used to be the director of a creative writing program, I used to tell my students, please do not, I don't want to hear the name Maya Angelou. I just don't. Like, I love Maya Angelou, but I just feel like her work does not in any way reach the depths of power and emotion that Lucille Clifton does. She's someone who gets read and studied more in like graduate programs, whereas Maya Angelou is someone who's sort of more commercially known. And this particular, and so she's also known for these short, tight, compactful poems. And this is my favorite Lucille Clifton poem of all time. I'd like for you to join me in reading this poem. There's a sort of repetitive refrain or line that begins with these hips. So anytime you hear me say these hips, I'd like for you to say these words. And so she has sort of two sections. One is these hips are, then it's these hips have, and then she goes back to these hips are. So we're going to 5 different times complete the line of her poem. So when you hear me say these hips are, I'd like for you the first time to say big hips, okay? Is that clear? Okay. These hips are. Big hips. They need space to move around in. They don't fit into little pretty places. These hips are. Free hips. They don't like to be held back. These hips have. Never been enslaved. They go where they want to go. They do what they want to do. These hips are. Mighty hips. These hips are. Magic hips. I have known them to put a spell on a man and spin him like a top. Isn't that great? Who is Maya Angelou? So I've had lots of really wonderful conversations with Tyrone Jeter. Phenomenal, again, another phenomenal person. He told me lots and lots of stories. I'm trying to remember what all the stories were. But he used to live in Nigeria, and he used to teach at a university there, Ahmadu Bello University. And he told me that this image is of a woman that he befriended, who lived in the village, but who also did, I think, some manner of work or labor at the university. And she was just a sort of powerful figure that had a major impact on him, both while he lived in Nigeria and when he returned to the US, and she passed away. He had heard through the grapevine that she passed away. And he said it really left sort of like a hole in him. And so this piece is really sort of dedicated to her. I don't think it's quite clear in the image that I have here, but when you get upstairs, you will see that there's a kind of bird-like image in the top of her hair. And that sort of speaks to this idea of an African-American folklore, when someone has died, they have flown away home. And so that's sort of what that imagery is in the top of her head. Okay, in the interest of time, I think we'll try to do two more of these. The next piece is from Larry Levy, who's also a local artist. I had to be honest, the first time I saw this image, it made me think about my mother. My mother passed away about 3 or 4 years ago. She had this deep love and affection for her sisters. And this kind of reminded me of the way that they interact with each other. And in African American culture, we call each other sisters, sister, all these sort of variations of it. Sisterhood is sort of a very important part of African American identity and experience. And I was also compelled by the title of the piece. And when you get upstairs, you'll see that the piece has muted sort of yellows and grays and whites. And what I was sort of drawn to is that while it is a sort of group, each woman is sort of seen individually, and that was intentional. So Larry Levy said that he drew the women in such a way that while they sort of looked like a group, that you would be able to see each of them in the shading and the coloring of the women. And I'm going to read the first part of the poem, and then when you hear me say, someone should have already told you that, I'd like for you to end the poem with this last section. This poem is by Warsan Shire, and this poem is called For Women Who Are Difficult to Love, and it is a meditation on the power of feminine individuality and how women are celebrated within their friendships, but often in their relationships with men are often told that they need to be redefined or to shift and change to meet the needs of male expectations. For women who are difficult to love. You are a horse running alone, and he tries to tame you, compares you to an impossible highway, to a burning house, says you are binding him, that he could never leave you, forget you, want anything but you. You dizzy him. You are unbearable. Every woman before or after you is doused in your name. You fill his mouth, his teeth ache with memory of taste, his body just as a long shadow seeking yours. But you are always too intense, frightening in the way you want him, unashamed and sacrificial. He tells you that no man can live up to the one who lives in your head. And he tried to change you, didn't you? Close your mouth more, try to be softer, prettier, less volatile, less awake. But even when sleeping, you could feel him traveling away from you in his dreams. So what did you want to do? You can't make homes out of human beings. Someone should have already told you that. Okay, thank you. I also think that this piece is interesting because Larry Levy said that he painted this in memory of his friend Alex English's grandmother and her sisters. So who knows Alex English? Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's the NBA basketball player. And then the last piece that I want us to look at before we head upstairs is it's another one of those pieces that had a personal and deeply psychological and emotional impact on me. And I think some of that is because of the fact that, again, I am a cultural heritage person. When you look at this image, what do you see or what do you feel? What's there? There's no right or wrong answer. Anyone? Okay. Scraping, process, struggle. Okay, good. What else? So these are meant to be, this piece is by Deborah Morehead. It's called Nameless Hands. She created it in 2001. These are, and you'll see upstairs, these are the fingers, so the digits right here. This is sort of what looks like, maybe like a sleeve. And for the last 20 years, she has sort of single-handedly shifted her gaze and perspective and how she approaches her work so that her work is literally about connecting to the ancestors. So she writes a lot about that, she talks a lot about that, and it is because about 2 decades ago, there was a discovery at the lower part of Manhattan, and it was one of the largest uncovered graves of enslaved persons. And she had somehow been able to trace her lineage to that area. I think now there's an actual like a monument there, but because of that incident, all of her artwork has been greatly influenced about enslaved persons, about thinking about ancestors and heritage. Her color palette also kind of reflects that. And the process of this work, it sort of looks like you said, a struggle or burning or tearing or charring. And I'm going to quickly go through this poem. Every time you see my finger raised, I'd like for you to say the phrase, "for my people." And this is a poem by Margaret Walker, and it's called "For My People." Everywhere singing their slave songs repeatedly, their dirges and their ditties and their blues and jubilees, praying their prayers nightly to an unknown God, bending their knees humbly to an unseen power, lending their strength to the years, to the gone years, and the now years, and the maybe years, washing, ironing, cooking, scrubbing, sewing, mending, hoeing, plowing, digging, planting, pruning, patching, dragging along, never gaining, never reaping, never knowing, and never understanding. For my playmates in the clay and dust and sand of Alabama, backyards playing, baptizing, and preaching, and doctor, and jail, and soldier, and school, and mama, and cooking, and playhouse, and concert, and store, and hair, and Miss Chumbi and company. For the cramped, bewildered years we went to school to learn to know the reasons why, and the answers to, and the people who, and the places where, and the days when, in memory of the bitter hours when we discovered we were black and poor and small and different, and nobody cared, and nobody wondered, and nobody understood. For the boys and girls who grew in spite of these things to be man and woman, to laugh and dance and sing and play and drink their wine and religion and success, to marry their playmates and bear children, and then die of consumption and anemia and lynching. Thronging 47th Street in Chicago and Lenox Avenue in New York and Rampart Street in New York and New Orleans, lost, disinherited, dispossessed, and happy people filling the cabarets and taverns and other people's pockets and needing bread and shoes and milk and land and money and something all our own. Walking blindly, spreading joy, losing time, being sleepy, sleeping when hungry, shouting when burdened, drinking when hopeless, tied and shackled and tangled among ourselves by the unseen creatures who tower over us omnisciently and laugh. Blundering and groping and floundering in the dark of churches and schools and clubs and societies, associations and councils and committees and conventions, distressed and disturbed and deceived and devoured by money-hungry, glory-craving leeches, preyed on by easy force of state and false prophet and holy believer. Standing, staring, trying to fashion a better way from confusion, from hypocrisy and misunderstanding, trying to fashion a world that will hold all the people, all the faces, all the Adams and Eves and their countless generations. Let a new earth rise. Let another world be born. Let a bloody peace be written in the sky. Let a second generation full of courage issue forth. Let a people loving freedom come to growth. Let a beauty full of healing and a strength of final clenching be the pulsing in our spirits and our blood. Let the martial songs be written. Let the dirges disappear. Let a race of men now rise and take control.